And welcome back. Years of headlines about the war in Ukraine mask a deeper narrative of historical pain, cultural fortitude, and an identity battle. A new book unveils this story through the lived experiences of the war's victims, the exiled, the suppressed, and the rebellious. Central to the narrative are neglected indigenous voices guiding Ukraine's journey to self-recovery and then also self-governance. Joining me now is cultural anthropologist and teaching professor at the University of Michigan, Dr. Greta Uehling. And thank you so much, Dr. Uehling, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You spent a lot of your work taking the time of really decolonizing Ukraine and doing the work and doing some heavy lifting there. From your perspective, just give us a little bit about what went behind the research and the work that you gathered.
Well, for the current book, I traveled. I was a Fulbright scholar in Ukraine. I traveled extensively within the country, and I did about 155 interviews that I taped and transcribed, and then analyzed using some software for qualitative data analysis. But a big part of anthropology is this modality of participant observation, where you really participate in people's lives to understand them as much as possible from the inside out.
And when you understand the lives of people from the inside out, obviously, it takes you in depth, if we can say the word, right? And
Yes.
to have an opportunity to see, hear, and understand some things. And there you see the book, Decolonizing the Ukraine. So inside your book, you're talking about, settler colonialism. And as you talk about that, you talk about Russia's occupation. And so can you give me a little bit of a background into what you found with settler colonialism and Russia's occupation?
Absolutely. So, Russia colonized Crimea for the first time in the 15th century. In the 18th century. And then gradually over time, Crimea became part of independent Ukraine. And it was in 2014 that Russian forces moved in and took over the peninsula. This was a time when in Ukraine's capital, Kiev, there was a revolution going on, and President Putin took advantage of that opening in the political opportunity structure to take control of the peninsula. And because the Crimean Tatars opposed that recolonization, they were targeted for oppression disproportionately at that time. So basically, when we talk about settler colonialism, what we mean is not just the control of territory, right, like in traditional colonialism, but actually the replacement of the population. And that's a process that we've seen in Crimea unfolding over several hundred years, whereby if the Crimean Tatars used to be the vast majority of the population, only over 95%, they were reduced. And in fact, once Russia took control of the peninsula in 2014, not only did Crimean Tatars begin fleeing for their lives, but somewhere between 800,000 and a million Russians moved in. So you can imagine how, in a place where the total population typically comprises about 2.25 million, how that affects the demographic balance on the peninsula.
Yeah. 1944 was a pivotal year and between the Russian and the Ukrainian conflict. Talk to us a little bit about the Crimean Tatars and really what took place in 1944 and how that shapes a little bit about what we're seeing today.
Okay, so during World War II, Crimea was occupied by German and Romanian forces, right? The forces of the Third Reich. And when Soviet forces finally regained the peninsula, one of the first things that happened was that the Crimean Tatars were loaded onto train cars and deported thousands of miles to Soviet Central Asia and the Ural Mountains, where they were interned in these special settlement regimes, right? They were put in barracks, essentially work camps. And as a result of this deportation, the conditions of which were incredibly inhumane, a significant portion of the population perished. Estimates vary from 25 to 40%, either in the trains themselves, which traveled for approximately 3 weeks, or in the conditions of exile, where people, perished from dehydration, malnutrition, and disease. And they were, at this time, it's really important, they were told that their group no longer existed. They weren't Crimean Tatars, they were Tatars who formerly resided in the Crimea. They were forbidden to speak about the peninsula. They were basically ethnically cleansed in Crimea and told that they didn't exist in places of exile. And they had to overcome that over the Soviet years, right? They began a national movement for repatriation that involved a letter writing campaign, lobbying officials, hunger strikes, sit ins. They inspired the entire rest of the Soviet dissident movement with their practice of samizdat, which is like you come up with your text, your demands, and then it's circulated because there's so much official oppression. You circulate that amongst yourselves. You self-publish and you circulate the information that you want to get out that way. So it was really a long process. And when the Soviet Union began to disintegrate, and Crimea had moved from the jurisdiction of Russian Federation to Ukrainian jurisdiction, was when they really began, when they were those charges, the trumped up charges that they had collaborated with the Nazis during the occupation were dropped. Their name was cleared, and they were given permission to return.
And I want to take a little bit and move it a little bit further, because when we talk about the Crimean Tatars, they have a unique connection to the war in the Ukraine, and so bring that home for us, because I think a lot of our viewers aren't so familiar.
Well, they. I think that in many ways they help provide the moral legitimacy of Ukraine's claim that they should regain jurisdiction over the Crimean Peninsula because of their indigeneity, right? So not only were they the majority of the population, but they have really taken a leadership role with the authorities in Kiev in terms of conceptualizing how to go about decolonizing the country, disengaging from Russian influence, and making plans to deoccupy that peninsula, both cognitively and militarily. And as a result of their leadership in this area, they have been promoted to key positions of authority within the Ukrainian administration. And I think that this is really important because, as a whole, what the book is trying to chart is how a group of people that survived centuries of colonial oppression ceased to see themselves purely as victims, began to advocate for themselves, and recalibrated their notion of who they were within the Ukrainian society. And this has opened up all kinds of opportunities for working together. And so here, Ukraine is incredibly unique because it's really, if we think about like anti-colonial struggles across the world, like whether it's Indigenous people in Australia or New Zealand or Canada, they had centuries of treaty making and treaty breaking that went on in the relationship between the state and the indigenous society. Ukraine is really in a category of one here in having, simply between 2015 and 2021, recognized the Crimean Tatars as indigenous, recognized that 1944 deportation as a genocide, and passed a law on indigenous people that has provisions for recognizing their rights. And so, what Ukraine has done for the first time in history, to my knowledge, is put indigenous status into the frame of an anti imperial struggle against Russia, enhancing its legitimacy and power.
And when we talk about the Crimean Tatars, I really want to take a moment to unpack this because you have them, you have indigenous people, you have what's going on in the world right now, and there is a correlation between both that you kind of make. And so I want to ask you a little bit about that because when you look at the experience of them and others who are marginalized across the state, the United States, and across the world, blend that all together for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, you know, in my work, what stands out as significant as a way to not only launch but maintain and sustain an anti-imperial and anti-colonial struggle is the ability to manage fear and retain hope. And I think, there's a Crimean Tatar activist who was imprisoned with a sentence of, I believe it was 17 years for simply speaking about the human rights situation in the Crimean Peninsula, which is deplorable, right? So the Russian Federation imprisoned him for exercising his freedom of speech. And from prison, he wrote that, no matter what our circumstances, we remain free within. And this is why I'm really interested in the sort of the cognitive and the emotional dimensions of anti-imperial and anti-colonial struggle, because he admonished his listeners from prison to always believe that change is possible. Never give that up. So the ability to manage fear of oppression and the oppression against Crimean Tatars in Crimea is horrific. The ability to manage fear and sustain hope were crucial to their ability to maintain their national identity, collaborate with other Ukrainians, provide insight for other Ukrainians.
We only have a few minutes left, but I do want to get an opportunity to hear from you with this. Earlier on, you stated 155 people that you interviewed in regards to doing the research towards your book, hearing a lot of stories, a lot of narratives, a lot of behind-the-scenes things. Out of those 155, what really stuck out the most to you about this work?
Well, part of it is the hope and the ability to manage fear that I was just mentioning, but I parse that in terms of the alchemy of adversity. And what I found was the ability of people who were in truly difficult circumstances to really look at their situation in the positive. And I call that the alchemy of adversity because people were continually in the practice of reframing their situation in terms of opportunity and possibility. And so, for example, I met a woman who was she was unhoused, but she had started to build a network. She had gone back to school. She had been displaced from occupied Crimea into continental Ukraine, and she gradually found her way, um, making friends with other Ukrainians and really forging a common purpose. And I think in the book, I talk a lot about freedom, and I really mean freedom, like not as a thing, but like as a practice of embracing it. And what both Crimean Tatars and other Ukrainians felt was that freedom was a quality, it was a value, it was a practice that they felt at least distinguished them from the project in Russia, right? So they're very committed to freedom of speech and democratic governance. And that's the glue that holds the Crimean Tatars and other Ukrainians together is their commitment to democratic governance and freedom of speech.
And Dr. Uehling, before we leave, I want to have an opportunity to ask you about where people can get your book. Obviously, the war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. A very hot topic that we're paying very close attention to here in the United States. And I see you got it up, but tell us
Yeah.
where we can get it.
You can get it on anywhere books are sold. It's published by Bloomsbury, so the easiest thing to do is go to the Bloomsbury website, type in my last name, Uehling. That's one way to do it, or anywhere books are sold on any online bookseller. Type in the title, Decolonizing Ukraine, and it should pop straight up.
Dr. Greta Uehling, thank you so much for being with us. Obviously, great work. 155 interviews, a lot of stories to be told to get a really deeper understanding of the Crimean Tatars, Ukraine, Russia, and actually how, something international has local and national impact. Thank you so much for taking the time and being with us.
Thanks for having me here.
All righty. Dr. Greta Uehling, our guest here on the Social Justice Forums. We'll be right back. Take a quick break right after this.